Hello everyone, good morning. Before we get started, I just want to do a quick sound check. So if you can hear me just fine, let me know. And if you're having any issues with the stream running smooth, just remember you can refresh your page and that can help as well. So if you can hear me just fine, okay, great. Thank you, Kathy, for confirming. Okay, so I didn't receive any specific questions except for from the critique students, so I just want to open up our session with some general questions from anyone who's attending. So if anyone has any questions about last week's material or this coming week, let me know. Go ahead and type it in the chat box. I did get some emails from a few of you asking about the lessons. I had actually set the release time at the wrong time. I set it for tonight, not yesterday, so I just fixed that this morning. And I am in the process of also uploading the third stage. So this coming week's lesson is very long because we have a lot of ground to cover with the closed grisaille or the full mixed grisaille. So it's split into 3 videos, and that third one is still coming. It's just taking a little bit to upload to the streaming. So does anyone have any questions about last week, about the underpainting? I know someone had posted in the forum asking about exactly how much paint I'm using when I'm doing the first initial oil sketch. I'm using a very small amount of paint. So sometimes what you might not be seeing off camera is that I load my brush on the palette, but then I might dab it off on a rag to take off any excess, especially with the white, because it tends to spread pretty far. And then I had another question that I'd just like to go over here is the terminology between glazing and scumbling. So I had clarified this in the forum, but I'll just go ahead and go over that really quickly here as well. So a glaze is anytime you're adding a transparent color. So that includes, you'll hear me use that term when we're doing the grisaille. So even though we're not adding like a bright color, we're still using umber as a glaze to darken. So the purpose of a glaze is to darken. So a scumble is when you're using an opaque color or semi-opaque color to brighten an area or to kind of cover and like cool off an area, but typically it's an opaque color. So anytime you're adding an opaque in a thin layer, you're scumbling. Anytime you're adding a transparent thin layer, you're glazing. So I just wanted to clarify that. If there is any terminology I use in my videos that you guys don't understand, let me know, and I can create like a little vocabulary list that will help you understand some of the terminology I frequently use in my videos. So Rosa, you asked in your ebook on doing a tonal painting, you use gradients. How will the final image differ when we do not mix? Okay, so to clarify, the first oil sketch that we did last week was just an abbreviation, essentially, of what we're going to be doing in the next 2 weeks, which is the closed grisaille or the finished grisaille. And in that one, we are going to do a gradient mix. So we are going to mix a value scale in umber and white in grays, and then we are going to paint opaquely over that oil sketch. So that oil sketch was just to help us start to move from a line drawing into a tonal drawing. It helps you kind of map out your overall values. It is not meant to be a finished underpainting in this technique. So what we will be doing is developing this underpainting in the grisaille layer this week and next week in much more detail, and it will look like a finished painting or close to it. And then we will start to introduce transparent glazes and then a second glaze and scumble to add further detail and finish the painting in color. But So what we are doing is a little bit different. If those of you who've taken like my color portrait class, we did this tonal sketch and then we jumped straight into color. In this one, we are going to do it a little bit more like the tonal portrait class, which is where we do the full grisaille up to a finished level, and then we introduce glazes of color at the very end. Oh, the thumbnails will get bigger, Jennifer. This is just the overall review. Okay, so Anne, yes, I just uploaded that lesson on glass. I did a digital lesson, so I did a digital painting to explain kind of the distinctions and differences on how to approach painting glass versus metal. So that is one of the first lessons for this week. So does anyone have any other questions before we jump into critiques? For those of you who didn't attend last week, I explained that there is sometimes a little bit of a lag between me talking and you responding. That's just because of the live stream. So if you post a question, I will get to it. And sometimes I pause a little bit to wait and see if anybody says anything in the chat box. You might, if you don't see the chat box, you might need to log in to either your Google account or a YouTube account in order to use that. I just wanted to explain that really quickly in case you weren't here last week. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and we'll do one more kind of wrap up of Q&A at the end. If anyone thinks of anything, just write down your question, and I'll get to it. Jeanette, let me answer your question really quick though. Do you need to do the painting part right after you transfer the drawing, or can the line work dry? You can let the line work dry. That is completely up to you. And I actually recommend that for a lot of people, especially if you're kind of worried or you have a tendency to lose your drawing during the painting stages. So yes, you might want to let your line drawing dry. It usually dries really quickly. Give it like one day and it'll be dry enough for you to go in and paint. Sometimes if I'm doing my painting and I don't want to wait, I'm just very careful when I'm painting around my lines. But most of the time I actually let my line transfer dry before I start going in and painting. And it's just because it helps me, especially if I'm doing something really intricate. I don't want to lose all that work I spent on the drawing. And that will always be there. So if you start to do your, if your line drawings are dry and you start to do your underpainting or your initial tonal sketch, and you don't like what you did, you can easily just wipe it off. Use a little bit of oil. Don't use like a solvent because it might take away your lines. And you can wipe off what you've done, and then your line is and your drawing is still there. So that's one of the other benefits to using this technique. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the critiques. Penny, you had sent in an update from last week on your line drawing, and so you wanted me to take a look. And I think this looks fantastic. You did make some of the corrections, and you did have some questions. Let me pull up your email here. I apologize that you did not get an answer because it was sent to my iCloud email for some reason. I'm not sure why. So if you guys are emailing me questions, either post it in the forum or make sure you're contacting me at the contact@leeartstudio.com email address. Just double check because I have like 3 or 4 email addresses and I might not see your question, and I reserve that one specifically for my classes. So your question was kind of how do you fade off, or would you be fading off kind of the pattern here as it reaches the edge? There's a couple of ways you can handle that. And kind of what you did in the drawing here is fine. So for example, where you have this cast shadow coming off, you will see a hint of the pattern in here, maybe. It depends on how high contrast the pattern is. But if I look at your reference, you can see it's just a little bit like a white versus a gray. It's really not like a high contrast pattern. So I think it pretty much disappears in the shadow. I don't think you need to worry too much about including it. And the same as it wraps over the edge here, you could indicate a little bit, but I think for the sake of the painting, just make sure that wherever this transitions, you could hint a little bit maybe at the finish of this flower, but then, and maybe like just taper that off, but you're obviously going into a different value range. Hi, Penny. No, you're not too late. I just started your critique. Would you like me to kind of back up a little bit? I was just answering some of your questions that you had sent in the email. While I wait for you to reply, I'm going to go ahead and talk about some other areas. But the way you handled this looks great as far as the pattern. You might consider, like, as this one starts to come to this edge, I realize you have a line here. Just make sure that that is a nice soft roll of the values. You don't want a real hard edge there. And it is pretty soft in this reference here too on the left. So yeah, I think that looks great. Let me look at some of the other areas here. The way you handled the flower, I know it looks really abstract, but that's perfect the way you handled this here. You want to leave it kind of simplified. Same thing with metal, and you'll see when I talk about how to paint metal in the lecture this week, how it's really pretty abstracted. And same thing with reflections, reflective surfaces like this one here. You really want to look at it in these abstract terms. A lot of people look at it and they go, oh, I just see so many details. But remember, metal is a direct reflection of its environment. It is a mirror, except it's on a form. So things might bend. You can see, like in yours here, it is reflecting this dark environment. So if you had it in a light environment, you would have a light reflection. Down in here, you see your reflection of the flower and the oranges. But one thing I want you to notice is that all reflections are typically, with the exception of the main highlight, which is a direct reflection of the light source. But any other reflections are darker in value than the still life. So keep that in mind as you are working. You notice, like, let's just take some samples actually, because this will really play a role when you're painting in your values. So let's do like a color sample of, okay, I just want to make sure I was doing this on a new layer. So let's take a color sample of the brown on here. And like the average brown on here. And you can see that that value difference is pretty big. Part of that is because this is seeing the back side of the flower, but there's the dark of that. And then if we just took like, let's take like just an average, you can see it's much lighter. The oranges, it's the same thing. And you'll notice it kind of takes on a little bit more of a dullness in color. Even compared to this shadow here, look at the chroma difference. So the reflections are slightly less chromatic in color. So when you get to color, you'll want to think about that, but also in value. That's really, really important to make sure you're not going just as bright as the objects themselves, but the reflections are going to be a little bit more muted. And the same goes for this. You'll notice that this takes on a different value than the fabric. So we can look at that value difference. Let me catch up on your question. Oh yeah, yeah. So it's in one of the shadow boxes, so the fabric just falls off on the edge. Yeah, and you can, it looks like it's on a table. So one of the things I would recommend, like you were going to bring this edge over all the way to the edge, that's perfectly fine. Just as you get it to round that edge here, just make it a soft edge, and that should work just fine. And you can still do this gradient if you want, because you actually have a really beautiful silhouette happening here where the edge of this here, let me get a different color. The edge of this is meeting the background. It creates this really nice silhouette, and you actually have that on this side too. And I would maybe bring this area up in value behind it just a little bit to enhance that silhouette, because that really gives a sense of air and space between your objects. And you can change the background color a little bit. So yeah, oh yeah, I just answered your question. So yeah, if you wanted to lighten up the background, like for example on this side, I would maybe bring it up about like that and then have it fade off. So that way you enhance that silhouette. But you can change the color. It doesn't have to be black or a gray, although that works really nicely in here. You could, and if you didn't want this to be a warmer green, gray, you could make it a cooler one. You can kind of tweak that, but in the beginning it's just going to be an umber and white, so you have some time to kind of think about what color you might want it. And glazes are really subtle, so you can actually add just a hint of color without it being overwhelming. So just focus on that value structure in the beginning. Let's see, I'm just going to take kind of a survey of other areas in your painting. Okay, so I do go over how to paint glass this week, or kind of like a glass-like object, which includes your bird. And I think you might want to include just a little bit more information for the bird for your drawing before you start your tonal painting. So let me just bring this over here so I can show you. I just want to bring it closer so I can see. Okay, so I'm going to just draw in a blue pen. So you have this dark shape here indicated, and you do have that overall kind of mass. What you might consider is looking kind of deeper into breaking up this shape here, just to help you a little bit as you move into the color stages. And pay attention to how I approach the glass. It's kind of, you start with the soft gradients and then you start to add these other areas. But since we're doing a kind of a classical approach, you will want to just give yourself a little bit more information. So you might sketch in this line here, and maybe even that shape there. So that's this one here. And then this one within that shadow, just to help give you a little bit more information. I wouldn't worry about doing that in the reflection over here, but you will want to maybe indicate that in the bird just a little bit more. I don't think you need to do that up in here, because look at how soft the gradients are. It's mostly where you have like a real sharp kind of change in value, it'll help you to find some of that detail. So in the reflected bird, one thing actually to notice, let me turn this picture into black and white real quick. Let's just look at it in terms of value. So notice how the values in the bird here are much less high contrast, even in the darkest areas, than the bird is in reality. So that's another thing that's happening. So it would be helpful for you to kind of just look at that value contrast between the two. And part of that is because it's picking up some of the color of the ceramic. So that purple is kind of influencing that, and it's not allowing those darks to get as dark. And the same thing actually goes with this background. If you think about what's happening right in here, right in this area, is reflecting this background over here. And so, but you notice how it has just a little bit more light in it. So I would actually, if it helps you, you can turn your photo into black and white to work from. That can be useful. And if you, because you have such a dark value, you might consider adding ultramarine blue onto your grisaille palette. So not for any of the other colors except for black. So burnt umber inherently is not very dark. It's probably about the value of this here. And so you might find it necessary to get the full range to take a little umber with some ultramarine blue, and I do that in mine as well at a certain point. But you might mix the two in order to get that darkest value, and so you can push your full range for your underpainting. Everything else in the painting looks great, or in your drawing. Do you have any other questions? I think you're ready for a transfer. Okay, so I don't think you have any further questions, but if something pops up, just let me know. All right, great job. So next week, I realize with everything going on in the world right now, it's a little crazy. So I think a couple of people feel like they've fallen behind. So I just want to reassure you, no matter what stage you're at in your painting, if you want to participate, if you signed up for the critiques and you feel like you're behind, it's okay. Just send me what you have and as far as you've gotten. That is perfectly fine. I realize that there's a lot going on, a lot on people's minds right now. So we'll just take it at kind of our own pace. There's plenty of time, and there will be weeks when the lessons aren't so intensive that you'll have more time to kind of catch up on your painting. So Penny, for next week, do the transfer, get the underpainting done. If you can start your mixed grisaille in some areas, then you can go ahead and do that. Usually the under sketch, oil sketch stage takes a day or two to dry, so it depends on when you can get it done. But if that's all you have for next week, that's fine as well. So I don't want anyone to feel stressed out about meeting the deadlines in that traditional sense. Okay. Alrighty, great job. All right, Kathy, I think I saw you in here earlier. So you had decided to completely change your composition from last week. I know we had kind of emailed back and forth, kind of playing around with the arrangement. This looks really nice. I think it's going to be a beautiful painting. So let's just talk a little bit about some of your concerns. I'm just going to shrink the drawing down here a little bit. So I think your sketch looks great. I don't have any major suggestions there. I'm going to draw in a little bit of blue. One thing you might consider for the cup here, and I can't tell if you have it lightly sketched in over here, but look for at least, even though, so what's happening here is you actually do have a shadow shape. It's just you have this saucer here, bounds of a line drawing. Do we put the lines there? Keep in mind is that a little bit of light here. So I would say see that this value mass here in general is it's a shadow shape and what doesn't. And it can be hard to see, especially if you have those really strong reflected lights. And the only reason I'm suggesting that you include that, I mean, it's a ceramic piece. So if, like in the case of this cup, you have these direct reflections. So here we have this direct reflection of the plate right here, right in there. And and then you have this form on the cup. But what you want to think about are those gradients and the value shapes. So when you're moving flowers on here, you might consider indicating the perspective, and it's already there in your drawing. Major shapes that you're seeing. That can be a useful. It's fairly abstract. I realize there's a lot of busyness there, so just remember to try and simplify. Think back to the lecture on values when I had that one of the, I think it was like the painting, the old master painting of the pansies, and there was like a lot of detail. There were all the leaves, and it was just a lot of busyness. And then look at how I simplified that digital painting in the beginning, because that's what I saw when I squinted down. So whenever you're approaching something really complex like the flower, just remember to squint your eyes and look for that bigger kind of grouping of values. It really will help when you start that tonal stage. I also recommend just anywhere where you do have a strong value shape. So for example, here on the orange, you have a shadow shape here. I don't usually indicate like highlights or any smaller value shapes like there. I mostly just indicate where the shadow and the light separate, so that terminator edge. And the same thing goes for this one here, that terminator edge there. There is even one right along here. So I would suggest just indicating those where they exist. It will help, it's going to follow these little forms. It will help when you're starting to move into that tonal stage. You have your cast shadows. You have indicated your reflections here. That's perfectly fine too. When you transition this into values, let's go ahead and take a look at this in black and white. So when you look at this in black and white, you can see, sorry, someone must be delivering a package at the door. Okay, so you can see that value structure of those reflections. So very similar to how I mentioned in Penny's reflections in that pot of any of the surrounding area was darker than the object themselves. Notice that the reflections of the oranges in the wood table is considerably darker than the objects themselves. So just keep that in mind, and using that black and white image can help you when you move forward with the grisaille. And also one thing to note is orange and reds just in general are deceptively bright to our eyes when we see them in color. So we look at the color because it's really saturated or the chroma is really high, and we go, oh, that's a bright color. That's a bright orange. But actually in value, it's maybe a value 5. It's right in the middle of the value scale at the lightest area. So just keep that in mind when you are moving towards your grisaille as well. Okay, so those are my main suggestions. This looks pretty good. I think your ellipse looks pretty good on the plate. I'm just double checking. It is a little confusing in the image here where this edge is back there. It is there, but it's kind of the same value as the background. So to prevent confusion in your drawing, what I would suggest is to indicate the completion of that. So you can draw through if it helps and kind of visualize that plate going across. And then when you get into your painting, I would make this little shape a little bit lighter than the background, or maybe darken the background a little bit, so that way it doesn't create a strange sense of the shape not being complete. So you're just trying to anticipate some of those odd tangents. Ellipses are really tricky. So I'm terrible at ellipses too. It takes a bit of work for me to get them correct. So it's normal. I mean, unless you're going to go through the process of finding, the vanishing point and you're using actual perspective, which is a lot of work as well. I find the best way is just to use that comparative measurement of height to width, like I showed in the video. Especially, I think what's tricky with your plate is that there's this, it's kind of a scalloped edge, so it makes it kind of hard to see. So if I drew the ellipse here, oops, here, let me just reset that there. I'm going to do this on a new layer. This program is actually really great for checking ellipses if you feel like your ellipse is incorrect. Because it has a built-in ellipse tool. So I just wanted to check that. That seems pretty good. I think you're right on the mark. So let's take that over and check it against yours here. Nothing's jumping out to me in yours, but let's just double check. Yeah, it might just be a little tall on the right side in the back. It's not that big of a change, but you might flatten that out, so I'll draw that in a different color. So this edge here, just bring it in and flatten it just a little bit. Maybe something in between, because this ellipse is not exact either, but something like that. And just kind of join it in with the front area. So you said you didn't put the second shadow in front of the saucer. Oh, the reflection. You could draw it if you want. You could also just do that tonally because it's a really soft shape. I wouldn't worry about it too much. It might be too many lines and get a little confusing for the painting. So that's what I mean by you're trying to determine, what's necessary for your line drawing and what's, you can kind of leave out and just indicate tonally. For example, in mine, I had that transition in the background where it went from dark to light, and I kind of indicated a loose line, but it wasn't real exact, and it was just a reminder to me for the tonal stage to transition the values in that area. So and you are missing your cast shadow back here, but if you don't want to include that, that's okay. You can kind of give a little more space to your objects there. Okay, so do you have any other questions? Okay, so how to deal with the tones in the background. Okay, typically I think a gradient always serves a painting better to kind of hone in on the focal point than just one flat value going across the back. And gradients are very easy to kind of invent. And you actually, if you think about it, you have a very subtle one that you could just push a little bit further. So let's just take some value samples. So if we take this far left side, and then we take this far right side, there's a fairly decent value jump between those. What I would maybe consider doing is pushing that value on the darker part. See, that looks like it's maybe that value. So we're going to go maybe 1 or 2 steps darker. Let's try that. Yeah. So you can like kind of push that. Let me grab a different brush here. This one's a little better at gradients. So you can push that value a little bit darker in that corner. You can also push the light over a little bit and kind of shape it in kind of a rounded shape that will help to kind of bring that focal point over. So if you look at the painting without the gradient and with, you can see how that having it there helps to bring us over to that flower, which is kind of one of our entry points into the composition. It is the focal point. It's right on that thirds line. You could go darker, but again, I remember we talked about balancing values. So if to bring focal point. So if you have a mostly light composition, the dark values, the darkest values are going to pull the eye. Just for demonstration's sake, let's say you wanted to go even darker in that corner. If you went really dark, suddenly it's going to start to pull our eye a little bit over. So we don't want to push that too much. I would say just a little bit more than what the photo has should help to refocus on the flower a little bit. If you wanted to go maybe a little bit darker, you could. Things are really easy to lighten up again, but you just want to kind of play with the idea of creating that gradient. That can look nice too, but I do feel like the lighter is sufficient. And so that gradient is going to just create a little bit more interest. I would also suggest just having a very subtle vignette up here, not real obvious. Even less so than that upper left side. So let's look at that without it and with. So you can see how that is really starting to bring that focal point around that flower. Does that make sense? So that's how I personally would handle it. You don't always have to do in vignette, but I do find that like if you just have one flat background, unless there's other stuff happening, like interesting cast shadows or something like that, it can often be a part of the painting that falls flat. So you want to enhance a little bit of what's already there. All right, do you have any other questions? Also, just to note, your initial tonal sketch won't be as nuanced as this gray, as like the finished or for even the first grisaille pass. So when you're going in to do that initial sketch, I would just do like broad scumbles over the cup and these areas, and you're just trying to get a rough value. So depending on the value that you toned your panel, you might find that this value here is around that range. So you can leave that ground color, and then anything that's darker. So try and think of it as like 3 values. If you had to break it into 3 values, what areas would you be adding more umber, and what areas would you add a little bit of white, and just leave that for the first sketch. And then when you get into the grisaille, you can get much more specific to the value structure for each of the objects. One thing to remember, I just want to point out, whenever we're painting something that's a white object, like for example the cup, we often go too white or too bright in the beginning. And so I just wanted to point out that the flower in its lightest parts is actually brighter than the cup, like down in here. And if you look at the brightest highlights, like here, it's brighter than the lighter areas on the flower. So you want to kind of reserve. So if I just took some samples of like each of the values. So let's take, that's your highlight value, or for the flower. That's the highlight value for the edge of that rim. And there is a value difference there. So it's very subtle, but when you get to that closed grisaille, you want to pay attention to some of that hierarchy. So just because an object's white does not mean it's going to be really, really bright. There are, like the average value of this cup here, for example, is more in that range there. So I just wanted to point that out as you're starting to move into the tones. Alrighty, great job. Does anyone else, I'm going to just go ahead and open up the floor a little bit. Does anyone have any other questions regarding upcoming material or last week's material for the class? Okay. All right, I didn't have any other submissions for this week, so if you are tuning in and you are a critique student, just send me whatever you have next week, even if it's just the drawing. If you're falling a little bit behind, that's okay. Just get as far as you can, and I'd love to help you. Later, within the next hour, I should have the 3rd final demonstration video, the main demo, up. The first 2 are already up and ready to watch, in addition to the bonus lecture on painting glass and metal. So you guys can log in and start watching those now. That 3rd final video is just really long, and it's taking a while to get it uploaded. So I will have that ready probably in the next hour. So if nobody has any other questions, we're just going to go ahead and wrap this up. If you do think of a question, later on, you're welcome to post it in the forum as well. Mommy duty calls. All right, guys. Thank you so much for attending, and I look forward to seeing your work. Have a nice Saturday, guys. And stay healthy. All right, take care, guys.